Howdy folks, hope you've all had a good weekend and welcome back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. It hopefully didn't escape your attention that I took a week off last week. Although I noticed that people were asking Jingles where's today's video on Tuesday and Wednesday and so on, which is kind of surprising because my taking the forthcoming week off was literally the first thing that I said in the last video that I did, which was Mingles with Jingles last week. But, well, whatever. Well, I suppose not everybody watches Mingles with Jingles. It certainly has among the lower of the view counts of the videos that are regularly put up every week, but I'm convinced that even if I had mentioned it on every social media platform known to man, there would have still been people saying, Jingles, how come you didn't put any videos up today? Because that's just the way things roll. But anyway, I'm back. Normal service has now been resumed. So, what did I get up to in my week off? My first time off, by the way, since Christmas last year. I definitely picked the right time to do it because Britain was being ravaged by a heatwave. Yes, I know, everybody in Arizona or Australia are laughing their asses off right now. Heatwave? That wasn't no stinking heatwave. Well, it's what you're used to though, isn't it? And I'm not used to temperatures in excess of 30 degrees. So, yeah, I'm calling it a heatwave. And if I had tried to get my regular work schedule stuck to over the course of that horrific rise in temperatures over the UK, it would not have been pleasant. So I definitely picked the right time to take it. What I did do, well, I didn't actually do an awful lot. It was just too hot. I did go out on Tuesday, out to a restaurant for the first time in over a year, and it was great. I played a bit more Final Fantasy XIV. The upcoming expansion for that, Endwalker, you can see the benchmark for that running in the background here. And I think it's safe to say that I'm through the honeymoon period with Final Fantasy XIV. I do still think it's a very, very good game, but it managed to really piss me off. And I'll explain why. And this isn't something that's limited to Final Fantasy XIV, by the way. It's something that you often see in all kinds of games. First, a bit of background. If you're into massively multiplayer online role-playing games, they're not all the same, obviously. If you're into endgame dungeon and raiding content, you probably should be playing World of Warcraft. If you're into story, Final Fantasy XIV is king. If you're into crafting, I've heard extremely good things about Elder Scrolls Online. If you can't make your mind up what you want to do and you want to try a little bit of everything, Guild Wars 2 is where it's at. Everybody plays these games for different reasons. There are certain types of activities in these games that people enjoy more of than other activities, and no two people are the same. I, for example, don't particularly enjoy player versus player content. I'm not implying that there's anything wrong with PvP in an MMO. It's just different people play games for different reasons. If you enjoy player versus player content, then by all means go for it. If you don't, you shouldn't be forced into doing it. And a fair number of games out there make this mistake. They force players into content that the players wouldn't ordinarily do if they didn't have to, because they don't enjoy doing it, or they're not very good at it, which is why they don't enjoy doing it. World of Warcraft has often been guilty of making this kind of mistake, which is surprising because they do have dedicated PvE, dedicated and separate PvE and PvP servers. They acknowledge the fact that not everybody wants to fight other players all the time. If you do, then you roll a character on a PvP server. If you don't, then you roll a character on a PvE server, where you can still fight other players, but it's consensual. And yet, despite this, they continue to make the mistake of forcing players into, for example, PvP content in order to follow quest lines to unlock legendary items in previous expansions, and the reverse is also the true, with PvP players being forced into doing endgame raiding content in order to get items that are best in slot for player versus player content, but which can only be found in player versus environment content. They've been making this mistake for years, and it's not just the whole PvP versus PvE thing. There are a lot of people who, despite the fact that they enjoy playing World of Warcraft, and that World of Warcraft is probably the best MMO out there for endgame dungeon and raiding content, do not like to do dungeon and raiding content. They prefer playing the game solo. In fact, an increasingly large demographic of MMO players fall into this sort of casual category. I count myself amongst them. Many years ago, I was a hardcore World of Warcraft raider. We used to raid 3 or 4 nights a week for 4 hours at a time. So much so that it really was turning into a second job. Well, I got off that hamster wheel, and I've been averse to dungeon and raid content ever since. I prefer playing the game at my own pace, thank you very much, and not having to rely on other players who may or may not be up to the demands of the situation in which the random dungeon finder tool has thrown us into. And I'm quite happy playing the game like that, without ever once stepping foot into any of the dungeons or raids that Blizzard have so meticulously crafted for the latest Shadowlands expansion. Or I was quite happy with it until I was progressing through the Kyrian Covenant questline and ran straight into a brick wall that required me to go into a dungeon in order to complete a quest. I was not happy about it, but I did it. Not through choice anyway. And that's the thing, game developers who think they know what you want to do better than you know what you want to do, and limit the choices available to you by railroading you into content that you wouldn't normally do if you had the choice. I'm reminded here of a quote from Blizzard's president and all-round weasel, J. Allen Brack, who's in the news headlines lately and for all kinds of bad reasons. But this is specifically about a question that he answered from a fan at BlizzCon several years ago. A fan stood up, was handed a microphone, and posed a question to the Blizzard alumni: would they ever consider creating servers for World of Warcraft that kind of preserved the game as it was in previous expansions? Call them classic servers, if you will. And J. Allen Brack very sort of dismissively, arrogantly and contemptuously answered the question by saying no. He then went on to further humiliate the person asking the question, because this is just what J. Allen Brack does at BlizzCon whenever somebody asks him a serious question that he doesn't like. Just, for example, look at the example of how he responded to the woman who asked him if they would ever consider creating costumes for female characters that didn't look like they'd just stepped out of a Victoria's Secrets catalogue, and responded to the guy asking the initial question by saying, "You think you want that, but you don't." Because, of course, J. Allen Brack knows what we want better than we do. So imagine our surprise when a couple of years later, without a trace of embarrassment, J. Allen Brack goes on stage at BlizzCon and announces the launch of the World of Warcraft Classic servers, as if it was his idea all along. What are the Classic servers, you ask? Well, put simply, it's World of Warcraft preserved in its original state prior to the introduction of any of the expansions. Exactly what he was asked, whether or not they would consider doing years earlier, to which he replied, "No, you think you want that, but you don't." By the way, the World of Warcraft Classic servers are probably amongst the most popular things that World of Warcraft has done in the last 10 years. Imagine that. Well, this is great, Jingles, but what does any of this have to do with Final Fantasy XIV? Glad you asked. I'm getting to it, but, as usual, I tend to take my time. So, I've been loving Final Fantasy XIV. There are many things that it does extremely well, but I suppose it was inevitable that at some point the honeymoon had to come to an end, and for me personally, that honeymoon came to an end at around about the time when I reached level 20. You see, while there is lots and lots and lots of dialogue in Final Fantasy XIV, every time you take a quest and every time you hand a quest in, and often in the middle of quests as well, you can skip most of it, but it is recommended, the first time at least that you play through the game on any given character, that you try to pay attention to what are known as the main storyline quests. The MSQ is the abbreviation that they're given in game. These, as the name would suggest, are the specially tailored quests that lead you through the story of Final Fantasy XIV from the start all the way to the finish. And I had been doing that. I mean, I would have been foolish not to. The quest rewards are fantastic, and they are pretty well-written quests. The difficulty curve is just about perfect, and if you're paying attention to the story given in the quests, it's actually a fairly entertaining story. But then I hit level 20 and I was given a new main storyline quest. And this quest said, use the duty finder to enter this dungeon. The duty finder is Final Fantasy XIV's version of the looking for group tool in World of Warcraft. It's a group matchmaking system, basically. But there was no getting around the fact that I was going to have to go into a dungeon. Something that I'd come to Final Fantasy XIV to get away from. And I couldn't just skip it. I had no choice in this matter, because if you don't follow the main storyline quests in Final Fantasy XIV, you will very, very quickly run out of things to do. Shit. Well, it's only one dungeon. How bad can it be? Well, it can be pretty bad actually, but it's going to depend entirely on the kind of players that you get randomly grouped up with. My character was a gladiator, which is a tank class. For the benefit of those of you who perhaps have never played an MMO before, traditionally you tend to get three different types of player character: tanks, healers, and DPS, or damage dealers. The tank's job is to ensure that they are the only one getting hit, and to be able to take it. The healer's job is to keep the tank up, and the DPS job is to kill everything, before the tank runs out of health, or the healer runs out of magic power. Yeah? So, traditionally, if you are playing as a tank, you are the one who gets to set the pace of the dungeon. As the tank, you are the one best placed to be able to judge just how many bad guys you can safely handle at once without, well, either overstressing the limits of your own abilities or running the healer dry as they struggle to keep you up in the face of all of the enemies that you're trying to tank at once. Now here's the thing, and this is both a good thing and a bad thing. Many of these MMOs, in order to maximize the numbers of players sitting in the pool available to go into these dungeon groups, and therefore reduce the waiting times that people experience, they will synchronize the levels of the players. What that means is, for example, if you're running a level 20 dungeon and you're a level 20 tank, you could end up with a level 50 healer and level 70 DPS. Now, if the game wasn't synchronizing the levels of everybody in that group to the same level, there is absolutely no way a level 20 tank would ever be able to generate enough threat to ensure that they were commanding the attention of all of the bad guys, and therefore were the only one taking damage when you've got level 70 DPS opening up with everything that they have. But because everybody's levels are synchronized together, that isn't an issue. This is a good thing. The bad news is that when you are in this situation, when you are a new tank who's never been in this dungeon before, you have no idea what to expect, and you're running with level 70 DPS, the DPS are not here because they want to be here. They're here because they have to be here. They're here to tick off one checkbox in the list of things that we need to get done every day in order to qualify for such and such a reward. They're not doing the dungeon because they want to do the dungeon. They're in a dungeon because they have to do a dungeon, and they don't really care which one. They just want it done. And so the DPS go running off, grabbing bad guys from all corners of the dungeon and bringing them back to you, the level 20 tank who has never been in this dungeon before, doesn't even really know how to use all of their abilities, and expecting you to handle it for them. And God help you if you can't. So that was my first experience of a dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV. It got done, but it was a hellish experience. But I thought to myself, that's fine. It's only one dungeon. Now I can get on with the main storyline quest again. So I returned to the quest giver that sent me off to that dungeon in the first place, handed the quest in, got some fairly good rewards, accepted the next main storyline quest, which took me straight to another dungeon. I was actually playing grouped up with Rita at the time, and I point blank said, nope, not doing it. Sorry. I don't enjoy doing this shit, and I resent being forced into it. I do not enjoy it when game developers assume that they know what I enjoy doing better than I do myself. A game like World of Warcraft is also guilty of this, by the way. I've already given you some examples, but nowhere near to the same degree. There are various different dungeons that you can do while you're leveling up in World of Warcraft, but they're all entirely optional. If you don't want to do them, you don't have to. You can just continue doing other storyline quests and skip the dungeons entirely. Not so in Final Fantasy XIV. There was more than one dungeon awaiting further down this main storyline quest. I didn't see them because I refused to have anything to do with them. I was playing with Rita, however, and she continued, and yep, it was just dungeon after dungeon after dungeon. Well, after a couple of days I gave in because there was quite literally nothing else for me to do, and so, grouped up with Rita, I entered the duty finder to get a group for this next dungeon. And it was actually not bad. I don't mean the dungeon itself. I mean, I couldn't even tell you what it was called. I can barely remember any of the encounters, but, well, the group that the game put together for us to do this dungeon with, one healer and one DPS, aside from myself and Rita, myself as the tank, Rita as the other DPS, They didn't massively overlevel and overgear the dungeon. In fact, Rita and I were the two highest level characters in the group. Rita had only seen this dungeon once before. I was here for the first time. I think the other two players were both also here for the first time. So we didn't have any overbearing, over-leveled and over-geared players trying to rush us through and complaining that we were going too slowly. As the tank, I was allowed to set the pace of the dungeon, only pulling enough mobs that I thought I could safely handle without running the healer ragged. And it didn't take that long before it was done. It was a relatively painless process. I wouldn't go so far as to say I enjoyed it, because I don't like doing dungeon content and I resent being railroaded and forced into doing it, but I didn't completely hate it either. A game like Guild Wars 2 does not do this, by the way, and in fact, in later expansions for Final Fantasy XIV it doesn't do this either. In Guild Wars 2, anytime a quest line takes you into a dungeon, you are given the option of playing through that dungeon in what I believe they refer to in Guild Wars 2 as story mode, where you can effectively solo the dungeon. It's still a bit of a challenge, but you're not relying on other players. You don't have to sit around waiting in a queue for other players who may or may not even know what they're doing, or may be too good and leave you struggling to keep up. I really hate it when games do this, when they try to force you into content that you don't want to do, because the game developers, in their arrogance, think that they know what's best for you better than you do. And it works the other way around too, or rather it doesn't work the other way around too. When you find something in a game that you really enjoy doing, but the game seems to be going out of its way to prevent you from doing just that. Ah yes, World of Warships. I was wondering when you were going to show up. So what does any of this have to do with World of Warships? Well, you may or may not know that I'm actually quite a fan of the Operations mode in World of Warships. So Operations is a game mode where you can play with a group of friends or a bunch of entirely random strangers if you're playing the operation of the week in, well, I suppose you'd call it a scenario. It's not like co-op battle. For a start, the bots in Operations are a lot smarter than the bots in co-op battle. In fact, a couple of years back, Wargaming actually experimented with taking the AI for the bots in Operations and putting them into co-op battle. And co-op battle players' win rates dropped by 20% overnight. The bots were just too good. So the bots are slightly more of a challenge, but there's more of a story in Operations as well. They play through scenarios where you have to, for example, rescue a carrier and then escort it to safety, or intercept a convoy of friendly ships that have been captured, destroy the escorting ships, and then safely escort that convoy out of the battle zone, and so on and so on and so on. It's not just a co-op bot version of the existing random battles. There's a little bit more to it in Operations, and I do find them a lot of fun to play. I do acknowledge, however, that they are nowhere near as popular a game mode as, for example, random battles, which is what the majority of people do enjoy playing in World of Warships, and that's absolutely fine. But the point is, you have a choice. If you enjoy playing random battles, you play random battles. If you enjoy playing co-op, you play co-op. If you enjoy playing Operations, you play Operations. And, well, I suspect for most people, while random battles are definitely more popular by far, most people do enjoy the occasional break from the tedium of random battle after random battle. And if that's the case, Operations are there. Except they're not really. They used to be. I mean, technically, they are still there. There's still an operation of the week that you can sign up for and be grouped up with a bunch of random players. But if you can get a group of 7 players together, which is something that we used to do on TC Freer's World of Warships live stream on Sunday with the Bob's clan, and we'd blast through the operations and have a great time. But, well, most of the operations are gone. They were removed with the carrier rework because they included aircraft, and, well, the whole aircraft system changed. With the promise, of course, that, they would rework them and put them back in at a later date. But they never did. You see, Wargaming insist, and I do have to acknowledge that developing an operation, or redeveloping an operation to make it consistent with the new aircraft carrier system is a lot more resource intensive than simply designing a new map, plonking it down in the random battle rotation, and letting the players make their own fun. But Wargaming insists that there's no point in devoting the resources to developing new operations or redeveloping existing ones that they removed and haven't put back yet, because the demand just isn't there from the player base. Hardly anybody likes playing operations, so it's just not cost effective for them to develop new ones or redevelop the existing ones. And on the face of things, based on the numbers, which I haven't seen because they won't disclose them, but let's say I trust them, and I do trust them, even if they're not disclosing the actual figures of the server populations of people queuing up for various different game types. Let's say that the numbers are not high enough to justify further development of operations. Okay. But why are the numbers not high enough to justify development of further operations? Is it because people don't like playing operations? If you listen to Wargaming, this is self-evident. Few people queue up for operations, therefore operations are an unpopular game mode. But is that actually the case? I mean, I'm not arguing that large numbers of people are in fact queuing up for operations. I couldn't argue that because Wargaming refused to disclose the figures, but I do believe that they're probably correct. I don't actually believe that Wargaming are lying when they say that the population is too low to sustain the game mode's further development, but I'm not entirely sure that the reason why the population is so low is because people just don't enjoy playing operations. I think that the reason why the populations are so low is because Wargaming have consistently run operations into the ground over the course of the last 2 years so that they could say that the number of people queuing for operations was too low to justify further development. I genuinely believe that Wargaming are deliberately neglecting operations in order to justify neglecting operations. They are deliberately creating the problem in order to justify not having to come up with a solution. Let's take a look at the evidence. First, the claim that they can't dedicate the resources required to redeveloping existing operations that have been removed, which counts for around about 50% of the operations that were available at one point, because the aircraft carrier rework so dramatically changed the systems involved where aircraft were involved in those operations. And yet they have put one operation back in, Raptor Rescue, which does feature 2 aircraft carriers. Raptor Rescue was reintroduced to the operations rotation, I think about a year ago, and we eagerly look forward to the return of other operations, i.e. all of the ones that also included aircraft that had been removed and have not yet been put back, and we're still waiting. Raptor Rescue works just fine with the new aircraft mechanics, so the claim that the new aircraft mechanics are too difficult and resource intensive to rework into the existing operations that we're still waiting for the return of is, well, more than a little bullshit. Let's take a look at other factors. People play different game modes in World of Warships for all kinds of different reasons, and some of those reasons are tied to the kind of rewards that are available. And certainly, while I enjoyed playing operations on Sunday with TC Freer and the guys from the Bob's clan, for the social aspect it was also possible to complete almost all of my daily and weekly missions and certain of the campaign missions in operations as well. And then suddenly it wasn't. This was a conscious and deliberate choice made by Wargaming. The missions didn't suddenly just bug out. They deliberately chose to no longer make it possible for you to complete your missions by playing operations. They didn't announce this either. They kind of sneaked this one in by the back door. Suddenly, we just stopped getting credit for mission completion when we were playing operations. This wasn't just a case of neglect. Somebody at Wargaming had to make the decision. They had to actually do something in order for operations to not count towards mission completion. If the numbers of people playing operations were so low that it wasn't feasible to justify expending resources on developing operations or redeveloping old ones and putting them back into the operation schedule, why did they feel the need to actively start penalizing people playing operations by refusing to grant them credit towards mission completion? If not, as part of a plan to drive down the numbers of people playing operations in order to justify refusing to develop them further. And while we're on this subject, let's take a look at the actual operation rewards, because there are various different degrees of rewards that you can claim for completing operations with increasing numbers of stars for mission completion by completing objectives. The more you complete, the bigger the reward you get, but you can only ever get this reward once. So it's probably not surprising that fewer people choose to play operations, because once they've 5-starred an op and they've got the 5-star reward, there's no real incentive for them to go in and do it again unless they particularly enjoy playing operations. And this is another reason that Wargaming produced for the low popularity of operations. But, well, hang on a minute. Wargaming, you do understand that you are the ones who determine what the reward is going to be. You can't use the lack of rewards as a justification for failing to develop the game mode. If you're claiming that people aren't playing operations because there aren't enough rewards inherent in the game mode, that's your fault for not making the rewards refresh and become re-available after a limited period of time. Whatever you might think is appropriate. They even went so far as to take one of the more popular of the operations, Operation Narai, which is an operation for Tier 7 ships, and take it out of the rotation so that they could actively nerf the amount of credits and experience that people got for completing it, and then have the balls to turn around and say, look, nobody's playing operations anymore. Well, yeah, because of you, you fuckers. But when you ask them, and I have, why the operations game mode is being neglected, and they reply by saying, well, the numbers just don't support it. It's not a popular enough game mode to devote resources towards redeveloping. And you present them with the counter-arguments that I've just listed here, pointing out that the reason operations isn't as popular as it used to be might be because Wargaming have deliberately and consciously been doing their level best to run the game mode into the ground over the course of the last 2 years so that they could justify not developing it any further, and I have. They just ignore you. Once again, we've got another game developer telling us that we only think that we know what it is that we enjoy doing. Who the hell are you to think that you know your own mind better than we do? We're game developers. We do this for a living. I'm starting to wonder whether or not these people actually play their own games. Coming soon, hot on the heels of the wildly popular aircraft carrier rework and the rework of the rework of the rework of the Commander Skills rework, submarines, whether you like them or not. Well, that just about covers this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. There is one other thing that I did want to mention before we go. You might recall the Top 5 Tanks video series at the Tank Museum. I was actually the first one that the Tank Museum asked to go down and do one of these videos. Since then, we've seen all kinds of celebrities invited down to the museum to film their top 5 tanks, and relatively recently they started doing their worst 5 tanks, and coming out this Friday on the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, it's my turn. I was actually supposed to do this around about 16 months ago, but unfortunately we went into lockdown for COVID and I wasn't able to. Over a year later, I finally managed to get back down to the Tank Museum and film my bottom 5 tanks, the worst 5 tanks in the world, in my not so humble opinion, and that's going up on YouTube, on the Tank Museum's YouTube channel this Friday. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. My brief holiday is over, it's back to work, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.